they're fictional ancestors, and the Bible mentions several other ones. In fact, there's like 12 tribes that are supposed to be descended from Esau, and 12 from Ishmael, and so forth. So, and though then you press back further and say, well, were these patrons of these confederations actual humans that they kind of vaguely remembered? Could be, but there's other indicators in the stories that they were originally astronomical personifications of heavenly bodies. So that when it says Abraham is the great father, which is what Abraham means, that and when God says, take a look at the stars in the sky, if you can count them, you'll be able to count the descendants you'll have. Well, that's a big hint that Abraham was the moon god and the stars were believed to be his children.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Sorry, my computer is trying to find something. I'm probably going to have to.
I thought it was an angel whispering in or something. So just to give this one example, why does Abraham try to kill Isaac and then cannot do it? Well, suppose it refers to the fact that the sun is the brightest object in the sky, but then the moon appears to triumph over it because the sun sets and the moon rises.
Right.
And then, however, its hold is not secure because it sets and the sun rises, and on, around and around this goes. Well, the Abraham sacrificing Isaac story may have symbolized that. Abraham, the moon god, would like to slay the sun, his S-O-N, because he appears afterward, so he's the sun, and he tries to slay him, but can't do it. Every time he's prevented, and then the son replaces him, and you can tell this because Isaac is said his name means he laughs, which seems to have something to do with a reference to the sun in Psalm 2. He who sits in the heavens laughs, referring to the smiling or the beaming of the sun. And a lot of this takes a lot of detective work, but some great scholars from the 19th century have done a lot on this and more, so you can kind of trace the evolution of these beings. Samson was originally a sun god. Moses, Elijah, Enoch. If you look closely at their stories, there are dead giveaways that these were celestial heavenly bodies personified, and that as time went on and Judaism began to form and to become more monotheistic, they had to demote these gods to legendary heroes. Like Hercules was originally a sun god, but Apollo replaced him, so he got shrunk down to a demigod with great powers. And this is a pattern of mythology all over Europe and Asia. And so it's like an archaeology in the text, looking at deeper and deeper levels of origins. And I go into all that stuff in this book and some others, and it is just endlessly fascinating.
See, and I've always wondered because Samson, the first time that I read through the Bible completely, I was probably about 9 or 10 years old, believe it or not. And of course, one of my favorite characters was Samson, and it always struck me how similar that character was. I mean, right down to both of them slaying a lion and their feats of strength and such, that they may have been just kind of variations on the same mythological personage, just it was different cultures had incorporated it slightly differently. Because if I'm not mistaken,
that's got to be right.
Yeah, because if I'm not mistaken, the Phoenicians weren't they also known as the Canaanites? Weren't those the same group, or was that kind of at least some of the stuff that I've been reading recently was that when we're talking prior to Greece, they were known as Canaanites, but then afterwards some of them became the Phoenicians.
Well, as I understand it, the Phoenicians and the Philistines were related, and they were both among the so-called sea peoples, and they were more closely related to the Greeks. Of course, that's the same neighborhood anyway, and there are loads of mythical parallels between Greek mythology and the Bible. But the Canaanites were Semitic, and they were, as far as we can trace, native to the Holy Land or Palestine or whatever you want to call it. And the Bible depicts Israel settled in Canaan or Palestine and caught between the pinchers of the Canaanites from the east and the invading Philistines from the west, out of the Mediterranean. This may not be completely true, but both groups are historical. The interesting thing is that the notion that the Israelites were distinct from the Canaanites appears to be a later fiction. They describe the Canaanites as a bunch of polytheistic idolaters with sex, magic, worship with Baal and all that stuff. Well, it looks pretty much like that what they're doing is to say that they're taking their own ancestors who simply were Canaanites, along with the Ammonites, the Moabites, and all these people that are said to be their cousins in the Old Testament. They were simply one more local group of so-called Canaanites and held the polytheistic religion. Another name for Baal was Yah, half of Yahweh, and so on. The book of Hosea says that Jews called God interchangeably Baal and Yahweh and so forth. Well, they eventually evolved in their own direction and moved toward monotheism. They got rid of idolatry. And what were they to make of the previous generations in Israel, whom they knew worshipped at the high places and sacrificed to Baal and all that? Well, they said, okay, they were our ancestors, but they only did that stuff because they got corrupted by those no-good Canaanites. And so they're really kind of vilifying their own ancestors. And often when they talk about those Canaanites, they're actually talking about their own ancestors, trying to distance themselves from them. So as to say, oh, no, we've always had the Torah, we've always known about there being one God, and it's like revisionist history.
Right.
The New Testament has the same thing with this idea that Jesus came and taught these Catholic doctrines to the apostles, and they taught everybody else, and those weirdo heretics were just agents of Satan, and it's a good thing they're all gone. It's the same kind of tactic to push your own version of the religion back into the time of origins to get the copyright on it and to brag that yours is the only true one and the best one.
Yeah, and I think
so the Canaanites, half fictitious, half simply some Semites from that area.
Yeah, and I think you see some of that even still today, especially in a lot of the, especially in the evangelical movement, but in a lot of the apologetics, they like to go back and claim that the Old Testament, has a lot of the prophecies and a lot of the stories and mythologies from there, or histories as they would put it, or actually allusions to Jesus later on and Christianity as we know it today, and that all of this was fulfilled and alluded to in the Old Testament. And it always struck me as just being more of the same, just kind of being anachronistic and reading back your beliefs back there, so that it made your beliefs seem to be more legitimate.
Yeah, that's right. They, unlike the Marcionites, again, they really interest me, who said that, look, don't steal the Jewish Bible. It's not about Jesus. It was given by the Hebrew God to the Hebrews, and it's not a bad book in many ways, but Jesus is not the predicted Jewish King Messiah. He'll come one day to help the Jews, but that's not Jesus. That has nothing to do with us. And these people, therefore, did not start trying to sniff out predictions of Jesus, and apparently recognized the folly of that. And the irony of it, because what is the deal with Christianity? Is it a new revelation brought from Jesus to clarify everything, or is it simply the predicted next step of the Old Testament? You on the one hand, you want to advertise, hey, this is new and improved. You got to get on the bandwagon. But on the other, you're saying, oh, if you're tied to the Old Testament of Judaism, that's okay because that's really ours too. It's just opportunistic. Islam did the same thing, and so yeah, it is just an apologetic strategy. And these guys that say that the mystery religions cannot have influenced Judaism and Christianity, it's an absurd argument based on what we know from the times, but they just want Christianity to come right out of the womb of Judaism with no admixture. Mm-hmm. And it's just not the case. Judaism was never hermetically sealed off from these Hellenistic mystery religions. Christianity wasn't either, but they just want to say, no, our Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant religion has always been real Christianity. Now, you're kidding yourself.
Yeah, and that was something that, growing up, that was something that was always hammered into me. But then later on, as I started getting into the more advanced biblical studies, I mean, even when I went to this tiny Southern Baptist college for a little while, took some courses through the Episcopal Church that I was going to many moons ago, they would start bringing up some of these things that we've been talking about here, and I always wondered, well, why doesn't this kind of information get disseminated to the average guy sitting in the pew? I mean, it opens up a whole new way to read and look at the Bible without being so dogmatic and stuck to, the authoritarian style of a lot of Christianity. But if they would just, if these things were taught to the congregations, maybe they could kind of start opening up a little bit more, maybe becoming more accepting of some things that they're so staunch against right now. For instance, the whole LGBT movement, there's I believe that a lot of the things that we see today in our society come straight out of the biblical understanding of Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, the misreading of Sodom and Gomorrah, stuff that Paul said, and that, maybe if they were to see how some of this has been changed and moved around and it hasn't all just been one solid block, maybe that would open them up to be able to, maybe think about it a little bit more rather than just blindly follow. I don't know.
Well, they might, and that does happen as people become more liberal, but an awful lot of conservatives are on the lookout, and they regard it as a tripwire if you begin to, as they would think, erode biblical authority by, they sometimes say Christianity is not good views, it's good news, it's revealed knowledge from God. And if you say, well, really it's a kind of a river in which many tributaries pour, that it becomes almost impossible to deny that it is just good views. It's just one more accident of history, so then most people want Christianity in the Bible because they're terrified of thinking for themselves because they've been told they'll go to hell if they get it wrong. So they don't want to exercise their wits. They're not stupid. They're afraid to think outside the orthodox box. And I think a lot of them kind of sniff that out, that if you begin to relativize the Bible historically or Christianity, you're no longer dealing with an infallible guide to belief. But oddly enough, the same thing happens under another name, kind of through the back door. Because prior to the 70s, most evangelicals and conservatives believed that women shouldn't be in the ministry. I mean, there were exceptions, like in the early 19th century, the Pentecostal and holiness movements. But most of them, no, women can't minister. And they had their Bible verses to support them on that. And women shouldn't be working outside the home, this and that and the other thing. But feminism, culturally, as it permeated the culture, they couldn't be invulnerable to it, and they began to have women pastors and all that, and economic factors meant that they had no choice but to have two incomes and so forth. Divorce, they used to be totally against that, but now as more of their sons and daughters, or they themselves, are getting divorced, they have to live with it and get used to it, and so they begin to moderate their views of it. And now I think there's, especially among evangelical youth, there's a real movement